Welcome back to Science Horror. This week I'm reading the first part of a story I've written called The Reality Serum. The second half is coming next week. This story was inspired by some psychological experiments I performed on myself, where I tried to see human faces as simply a collection of sensors instead of a familiar face. The results of this experiment haunted me for some months afterwards, and I don't recommend it to anyone. I have been advised that writing about Dr. Felton's so-called reality serum may help me come to terms with what happened, since I am still plagued with nightmares and sudden flashes of existential dread. The last thing I want to do is remember any of it, but I will try. The drug showed me things that no human being should ever see. It wasn't that it caused hallucinations, but rather that it showed me reality from a point of view that was completely consistent and yet utterly alien. You will ask why I took it, having seen what it did to Dr. Felton. You must understand the pressure I was under, the pressure we were all under. And of course I mistakenly thought I could control the drug. I thought it would help me solve the problem of nuclear fusion. Instead, it gave me only abject terror. 20 years ago, I was working for a company called Placer, which was based just outside Cambridge, England. Our name derived from a combination of plasma and fuser. We were trying to make energy by fusing atomic nuclei. Our approach was quite unique. We created two separate streams of plasma, which circulated in contrary directions around a ring-shaped tube, a kind of cyclotron, about 5 meters in diameter. Some of the plasma ions would collide, fusing with each other. This generated kinetic energy, which in turn generated electrical currents in the coils surrounding the ring. That was the theory. We all believed it could work, but there were major problems involved in stabilizing the plasma and preventing it from simply destroying the cyclotron. Dr. Felton was one of those amazing polymaths who'd made important discoveries in multiple different fields. He was highly skilled in theoretical physics, and he also knew a lot about neurology and medicine. "It's all one thing, Slater," he used to say to me. "The laws of physics are assembled in the human brain. They are a product of the human mind, just as the pearl is a product of the oyster. If that's so, why can't we change the laws of physics at will?" I'd say. And he'd usually reply with something along the lines of, "How do you know we can't?" "People can't walk through walls," I'd reply. And he'd say, "They might think that they can. It's other people who don't agree. You can't control other people's minds." We had variants of this conversation over and over again. True enough, a madman might really believe he can and does walk through walls. I would still call that madness. I regarded Felton's philosophy as a sort of efflorescence on his brilliance, not unlike the fungus that grows on jam if you leave it out too long. Some of his theories may have been a bit eccentric, but there was no question but that his was a brilliant mind. He had already produced original research in multiple different fields. Around 2010 he began telling me of a new drug he was working on. "You see, the brain assembles its view of the universe from mere nerve impulses," he said, "but it doesn't stop there with its creation of simple inanimate matter. It adds on many layers of interpretation and invention. My drug will remove those layers of interpretation. It will be the closest thing you could ever get to seeing the universe as it really is." "Is that actually useful?" I said. "I believe those sorts of drugs have a way of convincing people they're useful when they're really not." "This drug will be quite different to those," he said. "Think of it this way. An artist has to learn to look at a world that he sees as 3D and transfer it to a piece of paper or canvas, which is 2D. This is considered a skill, is it not, to be able to create a representation of a 3D world on a 2D sheet of paper?" "It's certainly a skill," I replied. "My own drawing remains obstinately at the level of a 7-year-old due to lack of practice." "And yet," he said, "there are certain brain conditions where the ability to view the world in 3D is lost entirely. People suffering from certain sorts of brain damage become immediately able to draw quite fluently because they no longer see the world in 3D and thus are merely copying one 2D representation to another. When you view the world with one eye closed, you are indisputably seeing a 2D image which your brain interprets as 3D. So you see, a large part of the skill involved in drawing only involves in overcoming a part of your brain that habitually does something that a normal person can't easily stop it doing. You're saying that I am bad at drawing only because I cannot see the world as it really is, at least with one eye closed, I said. Precisely, he replied. Now imagine what a person could do who could see the world as it really is in all its aspects, not merely in terms of dimensionality. I believe with this drug I may be able to make significant progress on the fusion problem. Well, I said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I'll be curious to see what you can actually do if you get this drug working. A few weeks after that, he said he had actually got the drug working, and he proposed to take it and set to work on fusion physics. He invited me to his house to witness him taking the drug, which he insisted would be a moment of great historical importance. Dr. Felton lived in an old farm cottage in Trumpington. I didn't have a car at the time, so I cycled out there to see him. Cars are almost useless in Cambridge due to the ridiculous levels of traffic. At the door I was greeted by Felton's wife, Sandra. She was incredibly nice and seemed genuinely interested in our research. As for Felton's pharmacological experiment, I got the sense that she didn't really approve, and I didn't blame her. As far as I knew, Felton hadn't even tested his drug on rats. He was proceeding on an entirely theoretical basis. I feel desperately sorry for Sandra now. I'm grateful that she doesn't hold me responsible for the horror that unfolded. She says we both could have tried harder to stop him, but neither of us could possibly have known how things would turn out. I suppose she's right, but I still retain a horrible sense of guilt. I'm at a loss to explain my subsequent actions. With the full benefit of hindsight, nothing that Felton or I did really seems to make sense. I will say this in our defence. At the time Placer was failing, we couldn't stabilise the plasma and the investors were getting nervous. Some of them were very close to pulling the plug. We'd all put huge effort into that company and had told absolutely everyone, investors, friends, former colleagues, everyone, that we were really onto something and it was going to work. We'd simply underestimated some of the technical difficulties involved, but those were all solvable in principle. I still think they were solvable, even now, after everything that's happened. The world needs a source of cheap, clean energy, and we were extremely close to finding one. We were also extremely close to bankruptcy. The pressure was enormous. On top of all that, my own wife, Jenna, was expecting a baby at the time. She was 2 months pregnant. The last thing I personally wanted was to have to start looking for another job right then, having lost my job at Placer due to our research having supposedly failed. Dr. Felton had been hired at considerable expense precisely because he was an out-of-the-box thinker. He had already solved problems that others said were insoluble. He was as close to a bona fide genius as anyone I've ever met. If he thought some experimental drug was the way forward, it would have been remiss of me not to at least give it a chance. Felton ushered me into his study. The study was one of those book-lined affairs, with overstuffed leather armchairs and an antique mahogany desk. I've always been rather jealous of Felton's study. On a coffee table he had placed 2 small glass dishes. One contained a small heap of green pills, and the other a heap of red pills. "Green means go and red means stop," he said jocularly, "like traffic lights. You see, the red tablets are absolutely vital to the experiment. They contain the antidote to the active ingredient of the green tablets." "What is the active ingredient?" I asked. "It's an indole alkaloid, but very complex," he said. "I've engineered it very carefully to bind to multiple receptors in the brain and temporarily inactivate them. The red tablets contain a substance that will displace the alkaloid at the receptor sites, reversibly binding to them in a way that will enable them to function normally again within about an hour. How long do the green tablets take to work? I asked. That's the really clever bit, he said. The onset of the drug is extremely slow. The maximum effect won't be reached for 3 days. Threshold effects may be felt after an hour. This means I can experience whatever intensity I prefer before stopping the experiment by taking the antidote. And you're certain the antidote will completely reverse all effects of the drug? I said. Absolutely, Felton said. So you see, the experiment is really completely safe. In the worst case, I'll experience nasty side effects, and I'll simply cut the experiment short with the antidote. Now, are you ready to witness history being made? As ready as I'll ever be, I replied. You may want to photograph this for posterity, he said, and he posed, holding one of the green pills. That's now the last photo we have of Dr. Felton while he was still sane. Then he placed the pill into his mouth and washed it down with a glass of water. We chatted about the reactor and life in general for about 2 hours after that. Felton didn't seem particularly different, although he said he perceived the effects of the pill subtly commencing after the 56-minute mark. I didn't notice any real difference in him, except he became particularly focused on the design of the reactor coils, saying we had been too influenced by previous designs. But that might have happened anyway. It certainly wasn't unusual for him to criticise the reactor coils. The next day was a Sunday and I wasn't expecting to hear from him. Jenna and I planned to go for a walk in Grantchester and then do a bit of decorating. I checked my email about 10 AM and Felton had sent me a message. The message had an attached diagram with a complete redesign of the reactor coils. In the email he insisted we had been blinkered by convention when we built the coils, and he said his new design would go a long way towards stabilising the plasma. I was excited, but I had no real way of knowing if he was right or wrong. I wrote back congratulating him, and then we went about our business. The following morning I received a distressed call from Sandra. Felton had wandered off and hadn't returned, she said. I asked her what she meant by wandered off, and she said he'd left the house without saying anything around 5 the previous evening, and she hadn't seen him since. He hadn't even taken a coat. Apparently she had seen him leaving, but when she'd asked where he was going, he had simply blanked her and hadn't replied at all. That was very unlike him. I advised her to call the police and tell them he may be under the influence of an experimental drug. Felton didn't turn up to work either. We fell to discussing what, if anything, we ought to do. Dr. Ridley, our director, argued that Felton was so eccentric that it was hardly surprising if he wandered off from time to time, and he was in favour of leaving things to Felton's wife. I said we ought to go out and see if we could find him. We knew Felton's habits pretty well, and if he was wandering around in a confused state somewhere, we'd find a better chance of locating him than the police. Dr. Turner, a youngish fellow who served as our principal electrical engineer, was extremely impressed with Felton's new coil design, and said that if this drug of Felton's could give Felton such insight in a few hours, it would likely fry his brain completely in a day or two. He was willing to go with me and scour the town for Felton. Ridley wasn't happy about losing so many members of his team, but we pointed out that it could reflect badly on the company if anything happened to Dr. Felton, and he agreed to let Turner and I go and look for him. Our first stop was Felton's house. Sandra told us the police weren't taking the matter seriously. People have a right to wander off without saying anything whenever they want to, they had said. We decided to leave Turner's car at Felton's house and walk towards the town, hoping Felton had walked into town in some sort of dazed state. As an afterthought, I asked Sandra if I could get into Felton's study, and there I picked up one of the red tablets. If we could find Felton, and he was in some sort of daze, we'd get the antidote into him before things progressed further. Felton didn't seem to have told Sandra much about the whole thing. Knowing him, he probably hadn't wanted to worry her, but she knew he was testing some sort of new drug on himself. Frankly, I thought Felton quite remiss in not telling her the whole story. She could have got the antidote into him before he'd left, if she'd known exactly what he was taking, the risks involved, and the fact that an antidote existed. Turner and I set off at a brisk pace, keeping a careful eye out for anything unusual along the way. Felton's house was quite a walk from the centre of Cambridge, but Sandra had already checked the local area quite thoroughly, and the next most likely thing seemed to us that he would have headed into town. The whole way we were peering anxiously into every side street and asking people if they'd seen someone wandering about in a daze. Several wags told us they couldn't tell who was in a daze and who wasn't. I suppose it was a fair enough point. Finally we arrived at the marketplace, and there he was, staring blankly at the market stalls. Something about him made us hesitate as we approached him. He didn't look in his right mind. We weren't quite sure how he was going to react to us. "Felton," I said, "your wife's been looking for you." He didn't say anything or give any sign that he'd seen us or heard us at all. "We thought you'd had an accident or something," said Turner. Still no reply. Turner and I glanced nervously at each other. Then finally he spoke. "Remarkable," he said. "They're simply clinging to the earth because of gravity." "Who are, Felton?" I said. "As if the centre of the earth is the final destination of all things," he said. "Aren't you cold?" I said. "You're only wearing a shirt." "Temperature is entirely subjective," he replied. I was glad that he had at least clearly replied to something I'd said. "I have the antidote," I said, producing the red tablet. He continued to gaze blankly at the market stalls. I realised that his eyes were actually following something. He seemed to be watching people's feet as they walked. I said, "I have the antidote, Felton." He turned to face Turner and I, but his eyes didn't lock onto our eyes. If anything, he seemed to be taking in our faces as a whole. "An extraordinary collection of senses," he said. "You remember this?" I said, proffering the red tablet. "It's about time you took it. You've lost your mind." "You're nothing but a talking sausage," said Felton slowly. "What?" I said. "I'm not a talking sausage. I'm your friend, John Slater." He continued to regard us curiously for some time, then abruptly burst out into manic laughter. "Talking sausages!" he exclaimed. Turner and I looked at each other. "I'll hold him and you get the tablet into him," said Turner. "All right then," I said. But as soon as Turner tried to take hold of his arms, Felton started to kick up a tremendous fuss. "Get off me!" he shouted. Then, seeing a policeman and woman over by the telephone boxes, he shouted, "Officers, I'm being assaulted!" The police came over swiftly, and we tried to explain the situation to them, but Felton was having none of it. Instead of laughing like a madman and wittering about talking sausages, he seemed to snap back into absolute normality, except that he insisted he didn't know us and that we'd grabbed him for no reason. The police seemed uncertain about what to do, and in the end settled for telling us to go away and leave Dr. Felton alone. They refused to hear my protestations, so in the end we had no choice. We watched Felton talking to the police from a safe distance down the road. He seemed perfectly affable, and the police eventually went away. "What are we going to do?" I said. "I have an idea," said Turner. Turner had this thing on his key fob that allowed him to find out where his keys were located using his phone. The idea was that if he lost his keys, he'd be able to find them again. His idea was to slip the thing into Felton's trouser pocket while he wasn't looking. The problem was we couldn't go near Felton as long as the police was standing there, or not without Felton kicking up a fuss. We decided to phone Sandra and simply watch Felton carefully until she arrived. Sandra arrived half an hour later, by which time Felton had wandered onto Sydney Street. He was wandering around staring at things and laughing to himself. She wanted to immediately run to her husband when she saw him, but I stepped in front of her and asked her to wait for a moment. "He's not in his right mind," I said. "He might think you're a talking sausage or something. He doesn't seem to recognise us." He'll recognise me, she said, eyeing him apprehensively. I'll go and speak to him. Try to get him to take this, I said, pressing the red tablet into Sandra's hand. Or else slip this into his pocket, said Turner, holding out the tracker. Then at least we can see where he is at all times. Don't be ridiculous, she said to Turner. He's coming home with me. She started towards him, then, as an afterthought, took the red tablet from me. We watched while she tried to talk to Felton, but we could see, even from a distance, that things weren't going well. At a certain point she tried to put the tablet in his mouth, and then he began to kick up a fuss again. "Get away from me, woman," he shouted, and we saw him push her away so violently that she almost fell over backwards. When she came back, she was in tears. "How long's he going to be like this for?" she said. "At least 3 days, unless we can get him to take the antidote," I replied. "Probably more like 6. Even as I said it, it occurred to me that I really had no idea if the substance Felton had invented would follow the usual profile of a drug, reaching some sort of a peak and then wearing off gradually, or if he was simply going to stay like that until he received the antidote. Sandra pressed her lips together and wrung her hands. Then she seemed to come to a decision. "Okay, give me the tracker," she said. Turner handed her the tracking device, and then she approached Felton again, from behind. She managed to get the device into his back pocket before he spotted her. As soon as he did spot her, he rounded on her, saying, "You again! I told you to leave me alone. I will not be molested." She ran back to join us. "Why don't we go to a cafe and we'll watch him on the map?" she said. "Surely he'll get exhausted eventually and calm down. He can't just wander about all day. He can't have slept for well over 24 hours as it is." "I can phone the police and try to explain the situation properly," I suggested. "Would you?" she said tearfully. "Yes, of course," I said. For the rest of the day we sat in bars and cafes, watching Felton's progress on the map on Turner's phone, and periodically going out to find him and check on him. I phoned the police, but I couldn't seem to get anywhere with them. They kept saying Felton was a free man and could do as he pleased, as long as he didn't break any laws. When I tried to tell them he'd taken a dangerous mind-altering drug, they asked me what the drug was, and when I told them it was an experimental drug of his own making, they said he hadn't necessarily done anything illegal, and in a nutshell, what he did was his own private business. By the time the bars closed around midnight, we hadn't made any real progress at all. Felton was wandering about near King's College, still laughing randomly at things. He seemed to have developed unlimited endurance and had become impervious to cold. Sandra was exhausted and out of her mind with worry. We told her to go home and try to sleep. We'd watch Felton and try to approach him again as soon as he started to appear tired. Eventually he surely had to run out of energy, and then Turner and I had high hopes of getting him to swallow the antidote. She was very reluctant to leave her husband, but eventually she agreed. Turner said he'd go with her and fetch his car, so we could sit in a warm car and follow him about, at least as long as he didn't stray into pedestrianised areas. That night was extremely long. By 4 a.m. we were both incredibly tired. I suggested to Turner that he sleep for a couple of hours, then I'd wake him up and I'd sleep for a couple of hours. By this means we made it to 8 o'clock, and then Turner went out and got us coffee and pastries for breakfast. Unfortunately, we started to attract more police attention as it got light. The police weren't keen on us driving around at 10 miles an hour and stopping on double yellow lines, even when we explained the situation. When they went to talk to Felton, he again told them we were harassing him, apparently claiming he'd just come out for a short walk. The police got angry and told us in no uncertain terms to get lost, or they'd arrest us for loitering and harassment. If only we'd known what was going to happen, we would have ignored the police and forced Felton to take the antidote, even if we had to use the most extreme violence. But we didn't know. How could we possibly guess how this was going to end? Thank you for listening. The next half of this story is coming next week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing if you haven't already subscribed to the channel. My name's John and you've been listening to Science Horror. New videos every Monday, usually. Until next time, sleep well.